प्रसार भारती अभिलेखागार की प्रस्तुति सदाबहार सुनहरे दौर का अनमोल खजाना।
Mr. Dayal, the other day we were talking about how independence came, and you told us about the changes that came in the Raj Bhavan immediately after independence. Were those changes particularly in dress or in paraphernalia protocol, or even in psyche and attitude and style of functioning of politicians, civil servants and people in general? And did those changes inhibit the functioning?
Well, the changes were very much more profound than merely sartorial. We were passing through a revolution, political revolution and a social revolution. There were changes in style,
Yes.
in method, in substance. And it was a vast process of transformation that took place practically overnight. Well, let's take the function of the governor. The last British governor, Sir Francis Wiley, was a skilled administrator belonging to the Indian Civil Service, and he was in the habit of administering without the benefit of parliamentary advice or constraints,
Yes.
known as an authority unto himself. And to some extent he tried to continue that practice. There were clashes between him and the pre-independence Congress government. But being a wise man and a very experienced man, he used to give in very gracefully. For example, when Dr. Kajru was Minister for Justice, on all mercy petitions in murder cases, would invariably grant an amnesty, convert the hanging sentence into a life sentence. The governor, while not agreeing with his argumentation, which was very lengthy and rather involved, although I, as Home Secretary, had, after very careful examination of the file by several of my officers and by myself, had said that it must be upheld, the death sentence. So the governor, obviously agreeing with me, said, I must concur. He didn't say, I concur. I must concur with what the minister has advised. So that sort of thing went on. There was also trouble with the British Inspector General of Police, Sir George Measures. Mr. Kidwai, Rasfi Ahmed Kidwai, as a Minister for Police, was in the habit of writing to him direct, rather peremptory letters. Well, under the rules, all letters addressed to head of department must be sent to the secretary of the department, namely the Home Secretary. And the letters got ruder and ruder, so Measures began to reply in the same rude vein. Well, a crisis came up, and Rafi made it a question of prestige of the government. The governor referred the matter to the Viceroy, and the Viceroy advised Measures to step down and to accept his retirement. So that happened. That kind of thing went on. But when independence came, then of course there were very few, hardly any British officials left. I persuaded the next senior British official, Sir George Pearce, to become Inspector General of Police. At that time there was only one Inspector General of Police in the UP, not 24 as now. And really there was law and order in the state. So the application of Parkinson's law to the post of Inspector General doesn't necessarily make for better administration or better peace and tranquility in the state. However, that's a digression. Now, with independence, the governor, Mrs. Sarojini Naidu, of course, had no experience of administration. She was a remarkably fine woman, a fine poetess, and a lady of great quality. But, for instance, after 6 months, she didn't know what my function was. When I mentioned that I was Home Secretary, she said, what does that mean? I said, well, I'm looking after law and order. She said, law and order? I said, where? State? She was surprised. She said, the whole state? I said, well, that's my function. So, I mean, you see, she didn't know at that time what the functions of various officials at different categories were. That's one great change. Therefore, the chief minister, he was called the prime minister at the time, Premier, Pandit Pant,
Yes.
was, of course, all in all. He had a cabinet, there was an assembly, elected under the old Act, 1935 Government of India Act, and the governor was a constitutional head, almost perforce. And that was one very big change. And that first generation of ministers in the UP was of a pretty high quality compared to what has been following. I mean, it's been going down and down and down. I mean, you've got a lot of...
That's how I wonder about one thing. That is, change in the people's expectation in terms of their relationship with the civil servants particularly. And then the civil servants who immediately from becoming representative of the crown to servant of the people. Did it conflict with their functioning or inhibit their functioning? And in times of disturbances and all that, how could you adjust?
Well, as you know, there was a lot of prejudice in Congress party circles against the Indian civil service. But it was Sardar Patel, who was a great realist and a good administrator, who realized that without a good, efficient civil service, as it certainly was, you can't run the country.
Yes.
And especially at a time of such great urgency when the transition was taking place and there were appalling problems for the country. It was he who persuaded the civil services to continue because we were all prepared with our resignations. I mean, had we wanted to make money, we could have made much more money outside the civil service. Then they realized that, look, these are people who are experienced, who are dedicated. This is their country as much as it is that of the politicians. In fact, we had been working for the country all the time while they were agitating. It's true they made sacrifices, many of them, of that generation. Not subsequently, I might say. You know what's been going on subsequently. So they came to respect us and to accept our advice. I mean, I was only in my middle 30s when I was Home Secretary. And all the ministers were considerably older than me. But I think they realized that I knew something about administration. And very soon, they began to repose more and more trust in us. Of course, I've known Pandit Pant from before because he belonged to Nainital, knew my family well. I was born and educated. But I knew Dr. Kaju, Mrs. Pandit, several of these people whom we knew extremely well on a personal, social relation basis. But that apart, I found that they were accepting our advice all along. It was very rare when, say, the Chief Minister deferred. There were differences, of course.
No, but what about the people? Could you strike out a relationship with people?
I'll give you just one or two examples. Rafi Ahmed Kidwai, I think, was a very good administrator. I don't say it because he took my advice, but one has to size up the person you're dealing with. Right. And I had to size him up and he had to size me up. And he found, I believe, that I gave straightforward, honest advice. And he never looked at a single file on which he had to pass orders. I'd go to him with a number of files and say, look, these are matters on which the minister's orders are required. He'd say, in Urdu, what is the problem? I replied to him in Urdu, well, this is the problem. He said, what is your suggestion? I said, this is my suggestion. He said, right. On every file, this happened. There were occasions when this did not happen, and I'll tell you about those. But I'd go back to my office and just write, discussed with the minister who agrees and issue orders. Those were never questioned, those orders. Now, many cases, politicians, influential politicians, would go to him for one favor or another, one request or another, which is totally against the law, totally against the rules. And those cases came to me, and naturally I'd oppose them very strongly. I should go to Rafi, and Rafi would agree with me. Now, then these politicians go back to him and say, well, what's happened in our case? He'd say, invariably, go and see the Home Secretary. He'll take a decision. So they came to me and they said, how is it that he's leaving things to you? I said, you better ask him, but this is it. So we function on the basis of complete mutual confidence. When Rafi came to the center, because in many ways he was an able person, good politician, but he had a little streak of very charming mischief in him. For instance, it used to amuse us, civil servants, to see this thing going on at the level of that sort of leadership. For instance, when the students were in an uproar, it was an old phenomenon. The Lucknow University students, they came to the secretariat and tried to enter it. There was no barbed wire, no walls, nothing those days. Anybody could walk in, with just one sentry. And so the deputy commissioner came to me, Lucknow, and said, well, look here, these people are out of control, what do I do? So I went to Rafi, I said, well, here's the deputy commissioner, he's come to me for orders. These are students. Unless, if you treat them as sacred cows, then we'll do nothing. But if you treat them as people who are behaving like hooligans, then we must take action under the law. So Rafi asked the deputy commissioner, what should I do? He said, let's catch them all. He said, yes, go and do it. So deputy commissioner went and he arrested a large number, put them in jail. And of course, the trouble didn't stop. There was more trouble the next day. But Rafi wasn't there. So we went to Rafi. Well, Panchi was in charge of law and order, overall subject law. Rafi in police only. So he said, where's Rafi? So he said, nobody knew. He just disappeared. He had the habit of doing this disappearing trick. But what he had been doing, we learnt, was he was sending pulao and kebabs and all sorts of food to these students in jail. And they knew who the benefactor was, the students. But they didn't know where Rafi disappeared. After 3 or 4 days, when the trouble had somehow subsided, he came out and ordered them all to come out. So they started shouting, Rafi Ahmed Kidwai ki jai, Panji Murdabad. Now, this sort of thing he used to do. Well, so I think in a way, when the call came to Rafi to come to the center, Panji was very relieved. These were sort of games among the politicians themselves that were going on. Then Lal Bahadur Shastri came. Well, he was a man of very, very great quality. I had the highest respect for him.
About Shastri?
Shastri. He was just at that time a humble parliamentary secretary. And I knew him very well because he was an informal, friendly sort of type of person. When he came, I used to send him my notes in English. He used to also reply in the English and then sign in Hindi. Gradually he began to write in Hindi. I got my private secretary to read out the Hindi and I dictate my reply in English. So one day he said to me, he said, can't you write your notes in Hindi? I said, I've never studied Hindi. If you want me to, if you insist on Hindi, I better take 6 months leave and try and learn the language. He said, no. So I said, do you insist on Hindi? Because your English is very good. So he said, I've given my word to Purushottam Das Tandon, so that I will do a noting in Hindi. So I said, well, I'm sorry, but I can't do it in Hindi. Or my noting will be absolutely childish and one can't deal with serious affairs of government in schoolboy or infantile language. So he said, no, but write in English. But can you sign it in Hindi? I said, no, I can, but I can. He said, Urdu? I said, yes, Urdu, I can sign it. See, the court language is Urdu. So Urdu we used to deal with, and I was also brought up in the Urdu tradition, not in the Hindi tradition. So this is sort of little things that used to happen. Now you asked this question as to what the expectations of the people were. Well, I'll give you just one example. Rafi Ahmed Kidwai said to me that, look, we have come in, the people expect that those who have been arrested under the Defence of India rules, which were pretty arbitrary, almost as arbitrary as the present protective, act, whatever it is. Those were war years, and the British were really fighting their backs to the wall, and this Defence of India rules had been enacted. A lot of people whom they thought creating problems for them were arrested, but the district authorities, in many cases, took advantage of this legislation to arrest all sorts of people like dacoits and others whom they couldn't send to trial on the basis of solid evidence and hope to get a conviction. So he said, a lot of people have been arrested, Rafi said, and I think they should be released. I said, but one has to separate the grain from the chaff. And we don't know, we'll have to sort out the list as to what was the offence charged against each person in prison now. He said, no, the best thing would be to get hold of all those in jail under the Defence of India rules. So, without any further inquiry, and asked, get the list as soon as possible. So I sent a circular to the Inspector General of Prisons, and these lists began coming in on brown paper, absolute sheafs of lists, enormous number, hundreds, thousands. Well, so I told Rafi, look here, the number is very large, and we don't know who's who. So he said, no, just pass them on to me, and I'll be able to sort it out and rest assured. Well, these sheets used to go to him. There may have been about 20 sheets of names, and at the end of it, he'd write, release, 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 without any names being cut out. Well, I had the release orders printed. As soon as it's came, I passed it on to my officers and said, no, issue the orders. So soon the jails began emptying out of these Defence of India rules people. I'd warned them, I said, look, a lot of people who didn't deserve to be released would come under this act of clemency, which you've decided upon. So he said, no, maybe one or two, doesn't matter. But he said, he said, no, this is interesting. He said, but we have to give the people the sensation of independence. That look, there's nobody now in prison under the Defence of India rules, which are used by the British for a particular political purpose. Well, it didn't take very long before I began getting protests from the district officers and the Inspector General of Police that a gang of dacoits here has been released, Mualdra has been released there, or a railway station master who had embezzled a huge sums of money has been released there. And that way, I should have thought that at least 40% of people who were released should never have been released. So when I went to him with this, I said, look here, this is this history sheet of this dacoit who's been released. What do I do? He said, ask him to arrest him again. So, I mean, you can't shut the stable door after the horse has fled. So, I mean, that shows that their politics came above administration.
When I was asking this question, what was in my mind was this, that today you see a peculiar love and hate relationship between bureaucracy and the people. But yours was very difficult time when entire ethos was changing. You were working with new sets of people, new sets of expectations, as I say. How did you strike out with the people, because you had to carry your credibility and their confidence?
Look, the civil service is supposed to be an impartial machine, neutral machine.
Right.
A true civil service in a democracy is meant to serve whichever government comes in terms of the policies which it enunciates, in accordance with the constitution and the laws of the land. Therefore, you find in democracies, whichever government comes in, there's no great change in the relationship with the people actually out in the districts and out in the villages. Whether you take France or England or America or wherever, the governments come and go. You have Labour and Conservative. In France, you have Conservatives and Liberals again. In America, Republicans and Democrats. They change. But the actual relationship between the people and the government is a constant, thanks to the civil service, which is impartial. Now, of course, there's one big difference that very often one found that the politicians, not the first generation who came from people who had made a success of their professions, then you found that a lot of the politicians were just professional politicians. They had no profession of their own. And there was a big social chasm between them and most of the civil servants. The civil servants were highly educated people. All of us in the ICS were from Oxford and Cambridge, those great universities, and we had many years at a rate belonging to a rather exclusive and elite core of people. So there was a big social chasm between us and them, which doesn't exist in, say, England and so on, because they all, in a sense,
You have said it.
There's some common factor. With the people, I don't think there was any great difficulty. Our district magistrates had no problem dealing with the people.
So, before we take another phase of your life that is coming over to Delhi, I'd like you to dwell upon something that you were in UP when disturbances were taking place. And I think you did have some role to play. You must have your views, ideas, attitude, and actions taken by you.
Well, you see, even before independence came in 1946, if you recall, there were very serious troubles in the Punjab, in Lahore, Rawalpindi, which gradually spread to the frontier area. And quite frankly, as soon as I heard that independence was coming, which I was told by the British governor, I could hardly believe it because it was so hurried. When he told me, he said, 6 months from now, there'll be an Indian governor sitting where I am sitting. I just couldn't believe it.
So candid.
It was just as sudden as that. So I went to Lahore to see the Chief Secretary and the Home Secretary there to find out about those disturbances. And what I heard appalled me. The virulence of the violence, the animosity between the communities which was growing. So I came back full of apprehensions that once independence comes, troubles are not going to stop at the UP border with the Punjab. And we must make some preparations. Well, I went to Panji and I told him about my fears. He was surprised at such a remark. He said, "But why are you getting so panicky?" He said, "Nothing will happen." I said, "Well, I'm a student of Indian history. And whenever there's been a change in dynasty in our country or regime, there has been trouble.
Bloodshed.
And sometimes very great upheavals. So we better be prepared. If nothing happens, we'll be very fortunate. But if we do make preparations, if we don't make preparations, then we are finished." And I said to him, that I believe in the Cromwell's motto. Cromwell, the great dictator, English dictator. Trust in God, but keep your powder dry.
Yes, very famous saying of his.
Where's the trust that you are showing in God? However, he said, in any case, where's the time to do anything about it? I said, no, I think we should have an independent security police force which is not charged with the district duties. And even our armed police is useless because they're armed only with muskets which fire a very short distance and they're useless. They're more for show than for anything else. And here the danger may be that it will face a major conflagration. What I propose to do, if government agree, is to recruit the soldiers being discharged, demobilized, and to put them through a quick course of police regulations, training in police regulations. They fought in Libya, they fought in Italy, they fought in Burma, all over the place. They're disciplined people. We don't have to teach them any discipline.
How you took decisions after your tennis in the field?
Yes, well, we were called to his house by the advisor in charge of supplies, Sir Archibald Ibbotson, who said casually that would you drop in the evening after your tennis? So 8 or 9 of us did so, and we were first treated to liquid refreshments, and then the problem was posed, which was that government were engaged in very heavy procurements of food grains for the armed services as well as for the rationing of the towns. And they had issued an order earlier for the compulsory procurement of food grains in the big mandis, having appointed agents and so on all over the place. Well, when soon after this rationing, this order was issued, the harvest came in, and we got daily reports from the mandis as to the procurement that had taken place. And we were appalled to find that even in big mandis like Hathras, where normally about 20,000 carts would have come in one day, only some 25 turned up. And this was repeated in various other mandis like Chandosi and Muradabad and so on. Well, after waiting for a week or so, this meeting was called, and the decision that had to be taken was whether this scheme would work or not. And each person had to express his views independently of what his senior officer said. And
Not simply I agree.
Yes, there was none of that then. They'd sort of go to you and say, well, don't you have a view of your own? They'd really chide you for it. And I was among the junior most present at that meeting. I had to speak up, and I told them what I felt. Well, a decision was taken by consensus that this whole exercise had to be called off at once. And before we dispersed, we were all assigned our tasks for the following morning. Notification in a Gazette Extraordinary, orders to be issued to the regional food controllers, to all the district magistrates, everybody concerned. I mean, it was all done by midday, just like that. In contrast, I found the cabinet meetings that used to take place in the UP, they were so leisurely, they'd go on all day, nothing would be decided. I'll give you just another example, that being in charge of the Home Affairs portfolio, I used to get a lot of information about what was happening all over the place. And I had half a dozen items of great urgency on which a cabinet decision had to be taken. One of those was to ban the RSS, because we found that in the western districts they had made very detailed plans to attack their Muslim neighbors with maps of villages, the utmost details. And the Deputy Inspector General of Police, Mr. Jaitley, he came down with two of his deputy superintendents and so on, with 2 trunk loads of papers, with maps and everything, which he had in the course of raids been able to secure. And he pressed for an immediate ban. I took him to the cabinet meeting. He showed all those papers, and this wasn't done. They said, well, we'll discuss this matter again and again. And for every cabinet meeting, I used to put up the same proposal. Now, this must have been sometime in October 1947. Till the time of Gandhiji's assassination, no decision had been taken. All that I was asked to do was, I should write a letter on behalf of the government, which I would sign, bring it to the notice of the leader of the RSS, I think it was Mr. Golwalkar at the time, all the evidence that we had collected, and ask him for an explanation. Well, Mr. Golwalkar was nowhere to be found. I deputed a couple of inspectors of police to chase him, and I got report that he's now in Madhya Pradesh, he's now somewhere else. It was never delivered to him up to the last. Now, this kind of procedure of having very long meetings and people talk aimlessly, it doesn't make for a speedy disposal of business. But I realize that in a democratic setup, there may have been political considerations why there was certain hesitancy about this. And also the partition was regarded as having a communal aspect, so there was some hesitation in the matter. Now, another thing I'd give you, that example, that when the upheavals took place, the western districts felt the impact. It was a very, very sharp impact, because the people who had suffered in the Punjab, they expelled over the border, they came to the UP, they came to Dehradun, the western districts, with tales of horror. And the people were inflamed. And huge mobs of Jats, mostly, in the western districts, they rose tens of thousands. And they began marching from village to village, pillaging and committing arson and murder. Well, I got an SOS from the Commissioner of Meerut Division in the middle of the night. He said, look, I've got no police, these people are coming, there are 10,000 of them, and the situation will be out of control. Well, what do I do? I said, shoot at sight. He said, but I've only got a military, there's only a tank regiment here. I said, use your tanks, whatever you've got. Stop this, because if you can't stop it there, then the whole province of UP, there were provinces then, will be enveloped in flames. He said, are these the orders of government? I said, yes. And in the morning I'll send you a telex message. When I saw Panji in the morning, About 11 o'clock, he came to office a bit late, 11, half past 11. I told him this has happened. He was appalled. He said, look, what is this? Going to shoot our own people? I said, well, they're criminals and murderers. That's the only way to deal with criminals and murderers. There's no other way you can stop them. He didn't countermand the order. He looked at it from the political point of view. Well, look here, what was his adherence, political adherence say? There were a lot of protests from Congress MLAs from the western districts that look here, your people have killed more rioters than Muslims, which happened to be a fact. But let me say that the trouble stopped at the border. Otherwise we'd have had it.
There's talking about Panji, because you had worked very closely and intimately with him, and soon after Sardar's death he came to be India's Home Minister. Could you dwell upon his personality, because he must be a very great man?
Well, Pandit Pant was certainly a towering personality, not only physically, but I think in many other ways too. I mean, he was an old-style liberal, a very good parliamentarian, and he understood his party extremely well. He kept a very good control over it, and he was very widely respected and enjoyed enormous prestige. And although he belonged to a very orthodox caste of Brahmins, the hill Brahmins, Pants and Joshis and Pandys are very, very orthodox. He was non-communal, which I think all his party members were not. Incidentally, the British government used to refer to Rafi as being ostentatiously non-communal, because Rafi, if there happened to be a Muslim officer being put up for a particular post, he would prefer non-Muslim for no particular reasoning, you see. But in a sense, I suppose, he felt that in our country, where there's all this casteism and a tendency to favor people from your own caste and your state, one has to make almost a demonstration that one is above these things. Now, Pantji used to take decisions very slowly, we felt, because in an emergency situation you have to act quickly. But I think essentially he was sound. I know it's said about his administration of the UP that he was more a law and order man than a development man. It's not entirely fair, because to keep such a huge state together in such troubled times, one had to pay attention to law and order. Today in the UP there's neither law and order nor is there development.
Yes.
And you can't have development unless there's some security. And the same thing goes for Bihar. So that I think on the whole Pantji was justifiably regarded as a man of a big stature.
Did he affect or did he influence the administration
Yes,
that's going on in the country?
Very much so. I think all of us had a great respect and regard for him. And he did have it for us also, because he wasn't interested in our families and whether we were comfortable and so on. He would ask us over to dinner. He had very simple food, I may say, he liked potatoes, different types of potatoes. Chapatis was a Pahari type of food. But we used to go and break bread with him. No, he was very considerate.
So, sir, we find that immediately after independence, you shifted to Delhi. When was it?
Well, it wasn't immediately after, it was...
About in 1948 or
48, yes. I came in March. I had no particular desire to leave the UP and go into the foreign service. But at that time...
so you went straight away to foreign service?
Yes. Panditji was setting up a foreign service, and he was looking for people to man it. And we weren't decided about what it meant, because all our sights had been turned inwards towards a career within the country, and we didn't know what the foreign service would be about. It's rather curious how I personally got into the foreign service. It happened when Lord Mountbatten came to Lucknow and was staying with Mrs. Naidu.
Okay.
And so there was a dinner party where senior officials were asked, and some non-officials. And Mrs. Naidu, whom we knew very well, and she'd known my wife's family for a long time and so on, and she was very fond of my wife singing. She'd ring up and say, well, please come and sing to me. So my wife used to go over to her place and so on. So after dinner, she suddenly said to my wife, Oh, you must sing, you must sing. And before my wife could protest, the occasion wasn't right for the song, for her singing. She had sent her ADC to my house to collect her tanpura and so on. When the tanpura arrived, my wife took it and sat down on the floor to sing. So Mountbatten and Lady Mountbatten just sat on the floor just in front of her. And we all then sat on the floor. So she sang a few bhajans and thuris and so on. Then Mountbatten and Lady Mountbatten turned to us and said, look, have you thought of going to the Foreign Service? So I said, well, since I hadn't really thought in terms of the Foreign Service, but he said, no, I think you should, why don't you consider the Foreign Service? So that was that. But soon after, see, there was a number 2 wanted for the Moscow mission where Mrs. Pandit had gone. Mrs. Pandit was a little choosy about having her number 2, or who her number 2 would be. And various names were peddled to her, not mine, and she rejected them all for one reason or another. She was a charming woman, a bit capricious, you know, as charming women have a right to be. And I'm extremely fond of her, and we still meet all the time. So then my name was suggested, even without asking me. I suppose she felt, well, the devil I know is better than the devil I don't know. So she said, so she agreed. So the request came from Panditji to Pantji. Look, this man, better release him. Pantji had got quite used to me and my ways, and I to his, of course. I had to, but he wasn't obliged to. So he said, well, you know, Panditji says this and that, and I don't know. So he said, well, I've told him that I'll be able to spare you if you agree, if you'd like to go there. I said, well, I don't know, because between the two of you, I don't have a leg to stand on. She said, then always for 6 months. That's how he went.
So, Dayal Sahab, before we discuss about your going to Moscow, I'd like you to dwell upon the creation of foreign service in India, because that was for the first time that a regular foreign service perhaps had been thought of and was being created, and your first encounter with Nehru, because you were one of the first people to be drafted in.
Well, as you know, Panditji had always taken great interest in foreign affairs. And in 1946, a conference was organized in Delhi of a large number of Asian countries in connection with the independence of
Asian Relations Conference.
Asian Relations Conference. The principal issue was the independence of Indonesia. Now, my younger brother was also a member of the Indian Civil Service and had been seconded to what was then known as the Foreign and Political Service. It was an elite of the elite services, where the people were chosen personally by the Viceroy, who was in charge of foreign relations, such as they were at the time, which meant mostly dealing with the princes and sending envoys to the Gulf area and Persia. He was in the then External Affairs Ministry, and so he naturally went to the Foreign Service. And he was Pandit Nehru's first private secretary dealing with foreign affairs.
Who was he?
My brother, Rajeshwar Dayal. And he was the Secretary General of the Asian Relations Conference. Panditji was extremely fond of him, really liked him immensely. So then Panditji began looking out for people to send to the various capitals, both as heads of missions and supporting staff. And whom should he rely upon but members of the Indian Civil Service? So the first batch of people who were inducted into the service came from the Indian Civil Service. I happened to be one of them.
Who were the others who came along with you?
Well, there was A.V. Pai was my predecessor, also ICS. He was secretary to the president. He had been there before me as a minister in Moscow. So when I arrived in Delhi with my wife, I was invited to dinner with Panditji, my wife and I. And I went in a Bangala coat, which I had recently made, because in British days we wore white ties and tailcoats. black ties and black tennis suits. And so my brother had warned me, he said, look, whatever you say, Panditji will sort of shout and sort of try to, he'll lose his temper. But don't be put off by that. You hold your ground and then he'll calm down. So I took that advice. And he asked us about how we felt about going to Moscow and talk to my wife and so on and so forth. And, I mean, he knew us from Allahabad vaguely, but not in this professional way. Now, at that time, however senior an ICS official may have been, he was not appointed as head of mission. He chose politicians, such as Asif Ali for the United States was the first, Mrs. Pandit for Moscow, and Krishna Menon for London. Even for Paris, a very senior ICS man called Sir Raghavan Pillai, who had been an acting member of the Viceroy's Council, was sent there as charge d'affaires, not as ambassador. And you had Chaman Lal, Diwan Chaman Lal in Turkey. Well, after a time, I think Panditji realized that these politician ambassadors were not such an unqualified success. As a profession, as it was a profession, it required some knowledge, understanding. It was a skilled profession. And we, of course, were entirely new to the job. But since the number of ISIS people available was not sufficient, then they had to make an ad hoc recruitment. And there was a selection committee. So Sigirja Shankar Bajpayee became the Secretary General, a very distinguished member of the Indian Civil Service, former member of the Viceroy's Executive Council. He, and then KPS Menon, also belonged to the old Foreign and Political Service, became Foreign Secretary. And the Home Secretary was R.N. Banerjee. These three, and assisted by my brother, Rajeshwar Dayal, they began to make these ad hoc selections. People like P.N. Haksar and all these non-ICS people of that batch, they began coming in. Dalal, and so this before the committee examinations started. Well, that mixed bag has been both good, bad, and indifferent. And I think perhaps the civil service people generally found to be all right. So this is the origin of the service. But very soon, I think Panditji then realized that the professionals who were disciplined, who believed that they had to first learn the trade, began to learn it very rapidly, would be suitable for being heads of missions. And after that first batch of politicians, subsequently the emphasis was on putting service people as heads of missions, and some politicians for political reasons were put here and there.
Did they formulate some norm as to how to create foreign service or just like this?
It was a bit ad hoc, I must say. Because there wasn't much time to really go into these things, and they saw a person what his background was education, and it was all done by interview, no written exam, nothing.
And what do you think of your encounter with Nehru?
Well, as my brother had predicted, when he asked about Moscow, I said, well, we look forward to being there. A very important experiment is being carried out there, building up communism, socialism. What do you mean, he said, what do you mean by experiment? Is it experiment? I said, I beg your pardon, that's perhaps the wrong word. It's a very important new system, may I say. Something I do see. I covered my traces. But thereafter we got on quite well.